Thank you. There we go. Got the recording in progress voice. Thank you so much, Sherry. And hello, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for giving me your Thursday night. And I'm so excited about talking about thriving through menopause or eating for success through menopause. It's a topic that I'm very, very passionate about. Clinically, because I'm a women's health dietitian, but also personally, because I'm a woman in the menopause era. And the idea of still thriving through the menopause is something that really resonates with me, that's for sure. So, as Sherry said, I wear a number of different hats, and those different hats, I think, give me a real different perspective of how kind of I see the menopause and how I support women to kind of go through it. So I started my career as a sports dietitian working in performance sports. So I looked after sporting athletes, I call them. And that role led me to coming across to London and looking after high performing individuals in the city and using the same principles in terms of sports nutrition and performance nutrition that we were using. And actually, it's in that role where I was looking after many of the partners of firms or CEOs of banks and hedge funds and people who work in the city, that's where I came across women going through the menopause transition, because I didn't study about it when I was studying dietetics at first. And I started seeing that for me, clinically, there was a gap in my knowledge of how I could support women that were going through this transition. And I'm a real learner, and I'm very curious, and I'm always wanting to kind of equip myself so I can support my patients well, or my clients well. And so I started going back to the science, which is what I do being a scientist, to see what the research said about how I could support women to eat for menopause. And you know what? When I went back to the research, there was very, very little. And when I then was like, okay, well, I wonder what books have been written about nutrition for menopause. There was one book at the time. So it was kind of 12 or so years ago. And kind of fast forward maybe 10 years, because I do some some media spokes work for the British Dietetic Association. I had been asked to write a book on performance nutrition in a city environment. And I kind of thought, well, this is a good opportunity, but I don't want to write a book about performance nutrition in a kind of city environment. I want to write a book called The Midlife Diet. And I pitched it to 9 different publishers 9 years ago, and every single one of them rejected it. And so it said that no one would ever buy a book on food for menopause. Fast forward 8 years, I then went and did a PhD where I looked at menopause and delved deeper into nutrition for menopause. And I actually couldn't finish my PhD in menopause because, again, there was not enough data being collected that would warrant me doing a whole PhD in it. So again, it was like doors being slammed in my face, left, right, and center. So it's just been such a beautiful thing to see that 8 years later, one of the publishers come back to me and say, "Do you want to write a book about food for menopause?" And this book is basically where I have been able to put all the years of clinical practice, being a dietitian for 18 years now, the research that I did throughout my PhD, but also see where the gap was in terms of the books that were already out there on menopause. And for me, as a performance dietitian and as a performance nutritionist and sports dietitian, I thought that lifestyle was missing in the conversation. And lifestyle is fundamental, whatever route you're taking to kind of manage your menopause. And so with this book, I bring a performance nutrition perspective into the menopause. And that's what I want to do with you tonight. I want to take you on a journey. I see some of you are eating your dinner. So the menu that I have to entertain you while you're eating your dinner is I'm going to start off with just understanding the menopause. I'm assuming that I've got lots of women on this webinar who are already going through the menopause and have a real understanding of it. But I'm also assuming that there's probably women who are perhaps not necessarily going through it yet, or there's women who've kind of gone through it. So I want to talk about what the whole transition looks like, because I think there's some misunderstanding around the menopause transition. Then, my first degree is in physiology and biochemistry. So you're going to have to indulge me because I want you to understand the physiology of menopause, which then would feed into what I, as a women's health dietitian, will be advising my clients to do. And also a lot of the research that has gone back into the fundamental principles that I put in chapter 2, which is all about eating for success. But you know what? I'm a practical girl and I love to give practical tips. So the main course is going to be me talking through what does the nutrition look like? What are my 4 fundamental pillars for you managing your symptoms and thriving through the menopause? And then for dessert, I've got literally the main things that people come to see me about in my clinical practice: low energy, fatigue, brain fog, cognitive, not thinking as quickly, sharply, and weight management, and just talk through some of the tools that perhaps that I would be using, or some of the check boxes that I'd be going through to kind of support them on their journey. So let's begin. And I've got here just, I've delineated what the reproductive stages of a woman's life look like very, very generally. And what you've got here is a menopause transition. Now, I had a debate with the publishers about the title of this book, because I wanted this book not just to be for people who are in the perimenopause experiencing symptoms, but I'm a public health researcher. And so I'm all about being proactive and preventative care. And I wanted this book also to be for my 38-year-olds who are not even necessarily thinking about the menopause transition, but actually the science shows that how well they eat as they go through their 40s is a game changer for the symptoms that they all experience. And so I didn't want to put menopause on the title, because I thought, my 38-year-old would not necessarily pick up that book, because there's a lot of misunderstanding around the whole menopause. And menopause, as you'll see here, the average age of the menopause in the UK and the USA is 51. That changes for people in different ethnic groups. So we know that people from Black and African Caribbean or South Asians or Asians will generally come through the menopause at a much younger age. But the average age is 51, and the menopause is actually only 1 day. The medical definition of the menopause is a woman has not had a consecutive period for 12 months and 1 day, okay? But a hell of a lot happens before that 1 day. And that period is called the perimenopause. And the perimenopause, you can actually split it up into 2. You have phase 1, early perimenopause, and phase 2, late perimenopause. And so you have 2 main female hormones, progesterone and estrogen. Whilst there's a lot of talk about estrogen, because, we should be waxing lyrical about estrogen, progesterone is actually the first hormone that tanks. And so phase 1, the symptoms I would be seeing women experience are linked to lower progesterone. So that would be things like your fatigue, mood, brain changes, sleep. Whereas actually the late phase of the perimenopause is when you've got low progesterone already, and you've also got low estrogen. In phase 1, you've got actually fluctuating levels of estrogen, which also might have an impact on things like weight gain, for example. So hot flushes is what typically people think of when they think about the menopause. Is actually a symptom that many women experience in phase 2, which is late perimenopause. But it's never this clear cut. Obviously, some of the symptoms change and flow from one stage to the next stage. But in general, there is 2 different phases that I want you to kind of think about. So we've got the perimenopause, which can be on average 7 years for a woman. But actually, that can be also from 4 to 14 years in terms of the perimenopause, where you get this hormonal flux that then manifests itself into loads of different symptoms that women experience. And I'll go into those in a bit. Then you got the menopause, as I said, which is that 1 day. And then you got postmenopause. So after you have not had a period for 12 months and 1 day, you are postmenopausal for the rest of your life. Now, if only the symptoms stopped as soon as you were postmenopausal, but unfortunately they don't. And actually, when we look at what happens in postmenopause, you also have an early postmenopause where you're still getting some of the symptoms of perimenopause, but perhaps less intense. And then the second stage of postmenopause, which is the late postmenopause, where you are not experiencing any of the symptoms, but there we are really concerned about your risk of chronic diseases. So we know that a woman's risk of heart disease is as high as a man, for example. More women die of heart disease than they do of breast cancer. And yet we don't talk about that enough. And that's because postmenopausal, our heart health is something we need to take into consideration. We also know that during this whole menopause transition, a woman loses 20% of her bone strength. And so osteoporosis and bone health being a really fundamental thing that we need to protect. And then one that is really, really close to my heart is dementia, because my mum suffered with dementia. And we know that a woman's risk of dementia is twice higher than a man's. And so it's really important that postmenopausal, we're focusing on that disease prevention. So I've kind of given you the outline of what it looks like. And, there's loads of different pictures that I could show you in terms of the symptoms and how the hormones change. But the message I just want to get across is like, our hormones are flipping phenomenal, because particularly estrogen, when you scan the body from head to toe for estrogen receptors, you find them in every single tissue. You would expect to find them in your reproductive tissues, but you also find them in your brain, in your eyes, in your salivary ducts, in your sweat glands, in your blood vessels, in your bones, in your gut. And that basically means there are a whole host of symptoms that come with the menopause transition in the perimenopause stage. And so there's 34 main symptoms, but actually there's 74 plus reported perimenopausal symptoms. So in chapter 1 of my book, the first thing I really want women to do is know you, because every single person's journey through this menopause transition is going to be unique to you. And so the more you know you're normal. So maybe if you're in your 30s, this is when you start getting to know your normal in terms of energy levels, libido, fatigue, mood, etc. The more that you can start tracking and seeing if there's massive deviations from that normal, because there's no blood test that can measure whether you're or not you are in the perimenopause. And so what clinicians like myself would be using is a combination of perhaps blood tests to eliminate other things that are not going on, and also symptoms that you might be experiencing. And you know what, ladies, most of us are going to experience symptoms. And I find this phenomenal that, here, this is an old study. This is a survey done in 2023 where I said, 80% of women in the perimenopause were going to experience some symptoms. But actually, recently, Zoe Predict study did some research using their Menoscale, and they said that 99% of women will experience a symptom. So all of us are going to experience some sort of symptoms. Most of us, they say, are going to experience at least a cluster of 10 to 12 different symptoms. And then 10% of us will experience the symptoms in a debilitating way that will have a massive impact on our quality of life. And yet, when you look at the research of how many of us are actually gaining help, is although we are all experiencing these symptoms, only 10.5% of us are actually seeking professional help to support us through our journey. So ladies, what we do very well is we just keep going through, even if it goes hard. Women are really, really good at just pushing themselves through even when it's hard. And so what I'm so passionate about is getting women to be empowered, to be proactive, and to gain agency over their health. And, I've kind of put some other symptoms that lots of women experience, like, 2 and 3 of us will experience brain fog. The average weight gain is 5 kilograms. Most of us will experience problems with sleep. And so I could go on, but I think you kind of get the picture. This is very, very new. And again, it comes from the Zoe Menoscale data, which showed that, these are the most common symptoms that women are reporting: tiredness and fatigue, irritability, memory problems or cognitive function, and actually hot flushes, which is what I said before, that women typically, or people typically classify with menopause, is actually the least common symptom that people are experiencing. But obviously there are some women who are experiencing those. So we know that hormones matter, and they have a massive impact when they start decreasing, which is exactly what happens during the perimenopause. But physiologically, that the fact that the hormones are so involved in so many parts of our physiology means that there's a number of different stories that are happening within our body. And so I talk about in my book the fact that there's a stress story, there's a metabolic story, there's a gut health story, and there's an inflammation story. And so I just want to go through some of the research in some of those, and then I want to give some strategies of how we can make sure that we are minimizing the impacts of all these stories that happen within our bodies. So I've got here the first one, which is the stress story. And I find this fascinating. And if I think, the difference in terms of the book I would have written 8 years ago, I wouldn't maybe have added the stress story in. And I actually, when I reflected on the fact that a lot of women within my clinical practice, we talk a lot about stress management. And this is why I put in a lot about stress management here, because We talk about the idea that we are a sandwich generation. When you are, in your 40s and 50s, you've got pressure from below. Perhaps you've got children at home, you've got pressure from above, elderly parents. At the same time, you are juggling career, and you've got this hormonal flux. And so that basically means that you are under pressure. And women are innately good at ignoring their own needs, which is why only 10.5% of us get help even if we're struggling. And what is fascinating is the research supports that actually there is a stress story going on through the menopause transition. So this Seattle midlife health study basically is what we call a longitudinal study, which looks at people over and observes people over a period of time. And they observed women in their 30s, in their 40s, and in their 50s. And they kind of asked women to report scores of, how stressed they felt, how anxious they were. And at the same time, they looked at markers of stress. And they saw that there was this increase as women go through the menopause transition in reporting symptoms of anxiety and feeling more overwhelmed and feeling more stressed. And actually, at the same time, when they started looking at markers of stress, women in the perimenopause and menopause transition had higher levels of cortisol, which is the main stress hormone there. And that actually makes sense from a physiological point of view because, if we talk about the characters that our hormones have, progesterone is almost like the keep calm and chill out vibe hormone. It actually is involved in calming our brains down, in reducing anxiety and helping us sleep, for example. And so you would expect that when progesterone starts decreasing, that levels of anxiety naturally, physiologically, if you're not proactive about it, go up. And at the same time, estrogen has this neuroprotective role, which is why, and actually when they look at neuroscience, they see that estrogen is involved in the gray matter, which is a part of the brain that is involved in mood, emotions, and memory. And so if you've got less estrogen, that part of the brain is not going to function as well. And so managing stress becomes a non-negotiable in the menopause transition because managing stress in any walk of life is important, but because physiologically your body is experiencing more stress because of the hormonal flux, self-care becomes something that we need to prioritize as women, even though we're not necessarily good at it. And so in my book I talk a lot about the fact that how are you nourishing yourself to manage your stress? And how do you know yourself so that you know how stress is showing up before you even feel like you're on your knees and you're about to burn out? And that's really key. So the stress story then leads me to the metabolic story. And this is another study which basically looked at three groups of people: women who were pre-menopause, perimenopause, postmenopause, and they gave these groups of people the same meal. And they said, we're going to give them the same meal and we're going to observe how they metabolize the meal and how their weight changes and how their levels of blood sugar, fasting insulin, and inflammation changes. And guess what the study showed? The study showed that people who were post-menopausal women had worse blood sugar markers and greater insulin sensitivity. I'll explain that in a bit. They also had more visceral fat and more inflammation. So that basically says to me as a women's health dietitian, if I give somebody who is postmenopausal or in the menopause transition a bowl of pasta pesto, they're going to metabolize it slightly different to how my 30-year-old would metabolize it, to the extent that they're going to be more sensitive to the carbohydrates in that pasta bowl. And their blood sugar levels are going to go a little bit higher as a result of it. And so this doesn't mean we need to cut out carbohydrates, but it definitely is a story for me to say we need to be conscious of the type of carbohydrates coming in, the amount of carbohydrates, and perhaps when the carbohydrates are coming in. The visceral fat story. So there's two types of fat. So visceral fat is basically fat around your abdomen. Now, that fat around your abdomen, classically known as your muffin top, for example, that's not just a muffin top. That fat is also what we call an endocrine organ. It's actually active. It releases inflammatory markers, which is absolutely what you don't want. Because guess what's happening over here? As I said, those women during the perimenopause or postmenopause have already got higher levels of inflammation. Now, when we look at this inflammatory story, the next slide is talking about that in a little bit more detail. We don't know exactly what is causing that inflammation. We just know that they're experiencing it. They're in higher systemic inflammation. And there's not a single symptom out there, whether that's brain fog, mood, weight, joint pain, stomach issue, IBS or digestive issues, that is not going to be exacerbated if you've got systemic inflammation going on. And so, the question I would ask being a scientist looking at this would be to say, well, we know all these things are happening. Why are they happening? And so the researchers then did something called mediation analysis to find out what the potential causes of this are. And the potential two causes are poor diet and your gut bacteria, which from a nutrition point of view is a huge win because it means that we can influence that. We have power over what we eat, what we put on our plates, and also the fact that our gut bacteria are also influenced by what we eat and what we put on our plates. So again, whilst it might sound like a sad story, it's an empowering story because we can do something about it. Just want to harp on a little bit more around inflammation because inflammation has an impact on short-term symptoms, but also on long-term health because there's not a single long-term condition out there, whether it's diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, that is not impacted by inflammation. And this is just basically showing a study that is linked with the fact that the inflammatory state, the perimenopause woman might be a risk factor for why they're perhaps experiencing more Alzheimer's later on. Now, I kind of alluded to the fact that we don't know exactly why this inflammation is happening. Is it the hormonal flux that's causing the inflammation? Is it the fact that the hormonal flux is leading to more cortisol? We know that the stress hormone cortisol also leads to inflammation. Is it that? Or is it the fact that when we're stressed, we perhaps don't reach out for a nice, healthy poke bowl at lunchtime, but actually we're wanting refined carbohydrates and sugar, where I definitely do, and more caffeine, and I might then not want to sleep as much. I might want my glass of wine. And all those behaviors that link with being stressed are actually then exacerbating the stress story? Or is it the fact that there's a gut health story going on and that the hormones and inflammation is having an impact on my gut, which is where inflammation begins? We don't know. We're still learning about this, and this is what I love about nutrition is that ever evolving story. But the fact is that we know that cooling inflammation is a pivotal part of the menopause story as well. And then I've kind of said, there's also a gut health story going on. And I love this because, when I was studying to be a dietitian 18 years ago, I did not even know that bacteria existed in our guts and they influenced everything from my appetite to my mood to my immune system. But so the idea that there's a gut health story is new, but it's also evolving to say we're still learning about this. But what is fascinating is that in your gut bacteria, which is called the microbiome, you have a special department, which is called the estrobolome, which is like an estrogen manufacturing center. How cool are our bodies? And so that basically means that there's certain foods called phytoestrogens, which are found in things like soy-based products, soy milk, tofu, tempeh, edamame beans, flax seeds as well. They contain phytoestrogens, which are much weaker versions of estrogen than in our bodies. But if we eat those phytoestrogens, this department in our microbiome basically metabolizes the phytoestrogens and recirculates them back into the system. As a woman in my early 40s, that sounds like good news to me because I know that my estrogen is decreasing and I'm going to be wanting my own body to regenerate through the food that I'm eating higher levels of estrogen. So there's a role in terms of gut health there, but there's also another role because we know at the moment we're still learning about your microbiome, but we know a diverse microbiome is a healthy microbiome. And women actually have a more diverse microbiome than men. So that's a positive. But what happens in the menopause transition is that the diversity decreases. Actually, postmenopausal women, if they're not proactive about managing their gut health, end up with the same kind of profile of bacteria than men do, which is perhaps why we see the changes in risk of diseases kind of aligning more to the risk of diseases that men have. And this means that there's a higher percentage of pro-inflammatory bacteria. That word comes up again. We don't want more inflammation, absolutely not. And also obesogenic bacteria. But the good news in all of this is that what you eat and how you live has a massive impact on your gut health. And so that is where the story comes in with what we can do to make sure that we are negating some of these physiological changes that happen in the menopause. So I kind of have talked about the two main hormones and the impact physiologically, but I'm a performance nutritionist and I'm constantly thinking about how I can bring it all together because that's what I do and that's the way that I practice. And I just, in the book, in chapter 1, I talk a lot about how the hormones are all linked and, the fact that if you're stressed, you produce less progesterone, which is then becomes this vicious cycle. And the fact that also you also have what we call happy hormones, which are also linked into kind of managing stress. It's all kind of linked like this beautiful orchestra. And we cannot get away from that when we're looking at the menopause transition and trying to empower ourselves to go through it in a way that is that allows us to thrive as women. And so, I'm just going to drop some names of different hormones, not just estrogen, progesterone, that also play a role. That when I write in the book about, what is in your toolkit, I also touch on things that let you release some of these hormones like dopamine, which is involved in motivation and pleasure, and serotonin, which helps keep your mood nice and stable, or oxytocin, which is involved in kind of key player in bonding and forming attachments, and also endorphins, which are almost like pain relief. We get them when we exercise. And so being aware of the fact that all hormones work together means that when you put your toolkit together as a woman going through this menopause transition, you're not just eating to make sure that you're looking after your estrogen, your progesterone, but you're also tapping into the fact that all these hormones, you have an influence on them in terms of how you eat and how you live. So let's go to the main bit, which is about how lifestyle, where lifestyle fits in and how we can kind of make this practical. So, my job, there's no one size that fits all. And I definitely don't want to sell that. But my job as a clinician working with women is about empowering women to find tools that fit within their toolkit so that they know what works for them as an individual in their unique journey. And there's a number of different ways that we can manage the menopause transition. And there's different tools within that toolkit. One of the ways is taking hormonal HRT, hormonal treatment therapy. But I'm not a medical doctor, I'm a nutrition doctor, so I'll kind of leave that to my medical colleagues. But what I want to focus on is lifestyle, and whether or not you choose to take HRT, lifestyle matters and is a formidable ally to your menopause transition. So, nutrition is my jam. So let's get into the nutrition bit. So how do we eat for success? So in the book, I talk about 4 pillars of success in terms of these are the fundamental frameworks that every single woman going through this menopause transition needs to adopt. And then she can personalize them. But these are the fundamental ones. The first one is eating to manage your blood glucose control. Now, managing blood glucose control is the cornerstone to all performance nutrition, but is also the cornerstone to managing every single symptom, whether that's the fatigue, or whether that's the mood, or whether that's the cognitive, brain fog, the cognitive effects, or whether that's weight gain. And also reducing your risk of chronic diseases. Now, this does not mean that we need to become obsessed and go out and rush and buy a blood glucose monitor. Absolutely not. But this does mean that we need to become savvy about how we can get our blood sugar levels nice and stable. And so I talk about things like don't cut out carbs. I find lots of women come to see me and they're in desperation because they're also confused, and they've got all these different people saying different things about whether carbs are good for us or not. They've cut them out completely. But it's about choosing the right ones, focusing on what we call low glycemic whole carbs, and making sure that we're not just eating toast and jam or pasta pesto, but we're dressing those carbohydrates, and we're always making sure that we're having some protein and some healthy fats with them. But then within all of that, there's also obviously the personalization aspect. But I'm just going to go to my next slide because this brings this into life. So how do I manage my blood sugar levels, Linia? Well, the first thing is the thing that you need to get hold of is the fact that carbohydrates predominantly are the foods that elevate your blood sugar level. So it's not about cutting them out, but choosing the right ones. So we want to be moving away from what we call refined carbohydrates, which look like this, to kind of whole carbohydrates. What I don't have in this picture is whole grains like, my quinoa, your sweet potato, or my barley or my oats. And I should really have that in there. But in general, I'm going to be wanting you to do that shift. Now, this does not mean that I never touch, I never put a crisp to my lips. Absolutely not. But it means that majority of the time, 80% of the time, I am focusing on my whole carbohydrates. And my 20% where I eat whatever I want, it can become these ultra processed carbohydrates, but definitely not going from, snack to snack, focusing on refined carbohydrate, which is what, women, which is so understandable, who are fatigued will be wanting to do. So, but carbohydrates, well, if I'm going to include something like quinoa into my lunch, too much quinoa is not going to be good for my blood sugar levels. So again, it's about making sure I balance that quinoa with including some lean protein, whether, that could be animal-based protein or plant-based protein like beans or lentils or tofu or soya-based products. And I also include some fat in there. So what is my plate going to look like? Because it's going to depend on your activity level. It's going to depend on a lot of other things. But in general, if I was just to say, this is your guideline, most of us are here. Half of our plate, vegetables and fruit that are colorful. Quarter of our plate, whole carbohydrates or whole grain carbohydrates. Quarter of our plate, lean protein, and then fat at every meal, but the amount of fat depends on your activity levels as well. So you might be putting, a tablespoon of olive oil or a handful of seeds or half an avocado. Just because, you get some good fat, it doesn't mean a whole avocado is necessarily going to be good for you. So it's always still a kind of portion game. And in the book, I kind of give much more detail about that. But in general, probably ladies, I'd be saying most of us, given the fact that I've spent most of my day, sitting on my bum behind a computer, it means that this is a plate for me. But if I'm more active, and more active, I probably would say, doing exercise more or less every day that is a higher intensity, then that can move to a third. And then I am a sports nutritionist after all, so sometimes I see people who are running marathons and ultra endurance marathons and things like that, and their plate changes even more. They might be having to eat more carbohydrates to fuel their sport and still getting the protein in there, but perhaps, the vegetables are coming in a smaller basis. So this is going to be different depending on your activity levels and your goals, but in general, I'll be saying most of us are over here. And I would say if you are eating this plate for your main meals, then that is going to be sufficient to help balance your blood sugar levels. Perhaps where you could make a difference in the evening, because remember what I said, we metabolize carbohydrates slightly different, is looking at reducing your whole grain carbohydrates, so your meal just being your protein and your fiber coming in there. And particularly also if you want to manage your weight, perhaps you might be wanting to do that. So eating to manage your blood sugar levels is important. Keep the photo of that plate, half vegetables, quarter protein, quarter whole grain carbohydrates in your mind as a framework. The second thing is eating for inflammation, right? We need to cool the inflammatory fire that is in our bodies as women in the menopause transition. And so what does that mean? Well, sometimes you kind of see these turmeric and ginger shots in pret-a-manger and things like that, which you might be thinking, do I need to do that? Well, unfortunately, there's no magic bullets. But when you look at the science for what is an anti-inflammatory eating pattern, it is basically a dietary pattern. So there's no magic bullets, and it's a pattern. It's something that you do consistently over time. And a classic anti-inflammatory dietary pattern is the Mediterranean dietary pattern. Now, I am doing this webinar from Milan today because I live in between Milan and London. And a Mediterranean dietary pattern is basically one that is based mainly on vegetables and fruit, but they've got loads of whole grains in there. They eat their protein, and they have, olive oil or nuts and things like that, but they still eat biscotti for breakfast. So it's not that they're excluding all these things. It's just the proportion of how they're doing it is more consistent to what we necessarily do in the UK or the USA. And then the other things that I love about an anti-inflammatory diet, if I think of just the Mediterranean diet, they put herbs and spices in pretty much everything. So that is key. And in the book, that is full, all the recipes are going to be full of herbs and spices and different ways that we can flavor our food, because those herbs and spices contain what we call polyphenols, which are actually anti-inflammatory as well. And then the thing that I love about the Mediterranean diet is it's not just a diet, it's a lifestyle. And so if I observe, today at lunchtime, for example, as a classic example is, when I'm at London, sometimes, most of the times, I eat my lunch at my desk. But in Italy, in fact, I'm not even allowed to do that. You stop and you eat your lunch all together. So it's also about how you eat. It's not just what you eat, but it's also about how you eat. And the how then translates into your whole lifestyle almost needs to be mindful to help cool this inflammation down, because you can eat the best diet in the world that's anti-inflammatory, but if you're stressed out, if you're not moving, if you're smoking, that's still going to be inflammatory. And so it's all about bringing it together. And it kind of, the thing with nutrition is there's loads of overlapping things, with managing blood glucose levels. I was talking about the importance of eating whole grains because they contain, they're slow release. And the reason they're slow release carbohydrates because they contain fiber. When I was talking about the inflammatory diet, I was talking about the importance of eating colorful fruit and vegetables. But, with gut health, it's the same story. It is, you need to eat more fiber, which is in your whole grains, your beans and lentils, your vegetables and fruit. You also need to be eating more, colorful fruit and vegetables, because the one thing that your gut bacteria thrive on is variety. So if you're the type of person who always takes a banana and an apple with you to lunch or for the day, or you're always snacking on the same thing, then you need to start mixing it up a little bit, because that variety is key. And so, there's a scientist in America that kind of came up with the idea that actually what we should be aiming for is this idea that we're eating 30 different kinds of plant-based foods throughout the week. And so that means every day you're eating 5 different types of plant-based foods. So I'll just say to you, if you're eating right now, look down at your plate. How many colors did you have on your plate? And that's a good indicator of how happy your gut bacteria are. So they love variety, but they also are alive and living, which means that we need to be looking at including fermented foods in our diet, because fermented foods contain these biolive bacteria that repopulate our bacteria. So things like biolive Greek yogurt, kefir, miso, kimchi are good ways of keeping our gut bacteria healthy as well. So, there's a role for supplements, but I'm going to be looking at you doing it in food first all the way. And this is another fundamental pillar that we don't get right, hydration. So many people don't get it right. And mild dehydration, if I tell you the symptoms of mild dehydration, it's brain fog, fatigue, low energy, digestive issues. And that sounds maybe like some of the symptoms I was talking about in terms of estrogen. And so a fundamental thing that women need to get right is hydration. Get your 1.5 to 2 liters of non-caffeinated fluid in there, and get it in there early. So it's no point you being dehydrated all day, coming home, drinking 3 pints and being up all night going to the toilet, because you also need to make sure that you're getting your sleep. And then I'll talk about caffeine and alcohol probably more in the questions that I'm going to get. So I've talked a lot about nutrition, and I, being a performance nutritionist, I'll be doing you a complete disfavor if I just talked about nutrition, because we have to look at health and well-being in a holistic lens. And that means that there's, nutrition is one pillar of well-being. Movement, sleep, stress management are the other pillars, and everything is interrelated and everything has a knock-on effect. And so eating for success is one thing, but chapter 3 of my book is living for success. And in the living for success, I talk about the importance of sleep, but I talk a lot about movement and also managing stress. And the reason I talk about managing stress is because I told you, the fact that stress increases the risk of us exacerbating every single symptom that we're going to experience, but also the fact that we're going to be more inflamed if we're in a stress state. And so I love the idea of thinking of yourself as a beautiful bucket that needs to always have something in it, because there are things that drain your bucket: not moving enough, poor nutrition, emotional stress, environmental stress. But there are things that pour into your bucket: good nutrition, meditation, yoga, nature, singing, painting, cold water therapy, movement. I could go on. And so the question I have for you is, how are you filling your bucket to make sure there's always something in there? One of the amazing things is that movement is one way of adding into our bucket, but it can also drain our bucket if we do too much of it, right? So there's that delicate balance. But, it's sometimes a dilemma for women because they say to me, Linia, I know I should be exercising, but I'm exhausted and my joints ache, my muscles ache, and I just have no time for it. And so we want you to move because we also know that that's important in terms of, muscle tone, but it's also great for kind of managing stress. But my thing with movement is I would probably say to women is that we need to almost just capitalize on the things that we do day by day. And there's something called NEAT, which is non-exercise induced thermogenesis, which is just how active are you on your day? We are sitting far too much. And the fact that we have less muscle mass means our metabolism is slowing down as we get older. And so how are you boosting your metabolism throughout the day? So I'm sitting now, but I was standing a lot throughout my day. I have a standing desk just to keep my metabolism elevated, or walking more. And that walking shouldn't just be the morning I walk my dog and then I'm done, and I walk in the evening and I'm done, but it's actually during your day, how are you moving? And then, as you get more energy with managing your blood sugar levels, etc., then bringing in things like resistance training or restorative movement like yoga and Pilates sometimes when you haven't slept, rather than just going out there and doing some high intensity interval training. So it comes back to knowing you and finding something that's enjoyable, so it's sustainable, so it feeds back into that bucket. So I realized that I said I was going to leave 15 minutes for questions, but I just want to go through three kind of case studies of things that I see women wanting some support about, and just the things that I would be tackling or talking about or unpacking a little bit in consultation. And then I'll kind of close. So just 5 more minutes and then I'll open it up to questions. So one of the main reasons people come see me is because they feel exhausted. They feel like they're walking through treacle. The energy levels are so low, they're reaching out for sugar and caffeine to kind of keep them going. So what are the things that I would be kind of checking in my checklist as a women's health dietitian? Well, the first thing, are you hydrated? Because that is fundamental for energy levels, because our body is more than 70% water. If we are not well hydrated, we're going to start feeling sluggish. Okay. So the first thing is get into a meta program, and psychologists talk about meta programs, which is doing it without even thinking about it, like how you brush your teeth. You don't think about it. It's your parents drilled it into you. Hydration needs to become a meta program. Okay, so how are you hydrating? Then I would talk about stabilizing blood sugar levels, and that becomes an individual thing. Perhaps, some might not be eating enough protein for breakfast. I'd be putting some protein at breakfast to kind of help them start their day with kind of balanced blood sugar levels. Then I'd be unshackling them from sugar. And, you need to know you as an individual. Some people work well with going cold turkey, but that doesn't work for everybody. But the issue is that, if you have been using sugar as a crutch to kind of boost your energy levels up, then it's just exacerbating that roller coaster ride that perhaps you're on. And so you're going to need to perhaps start looking at ways of how you unshackle with sugar. And I love the fact that our bodies are just so adaptable. Our taste buds are renewed every month. So something like, and I say this all the time to kind of clients, and I'm, people who love their milk chocolate. And I'm like, I want you to start eating dark chocolate. They say, I hate it. I don't like the taste of it. And actually, when they do unshackle from sugar, they actually like, oh my goodness, I tasted some milk chocolate and it was sickly sweet, because you can kind of learn to adapt and adjust your taste buds. Then I'm going to say, be smart with your portions, because carbohydrate is good, but too much might make you feel sluggish, particularly at lunchtime, and that's why perhaps sometimes if you do eat a sandwich, you do feel sluggish because it's got probably the ratio of carbohydrate to protein is not quite right. And so you need to start becoming more careful or more on top of your carbohydrate and protein portions, so that your carbohydrates are fueling you, but not tiring you out, and your protein is perking you up, but not necessarily you're eating so much of it that you're not leaving room for the importance of carbohydrates as well. There's a saying which is prepare to plan to. I can't do. I've totally forgotten it. But it's the key is that you need to be prepared, because if you're not prepared, even I, who is a dietitian, will fail. So taking some time to kind of think about how you are going to make it work, because if you have healthy food around you in your environment, you're more likely to actually do it. And so, in the book, what I wanted to do is give recipes that gave you the capacity to be able to either do them really quickly or helped you be able to kind of plan ahead so you can make healthy eating more likely to be doable. And then the other things here are, again, me thinking holistically, whilst you're tired, moving is actually one way of energizing you, getting out there. And even if it's a walk, it can energize you. Maybe you need to spend more time in bed. Maybe that's the way that you can kind of boost your energy levels. And then in terms of supplementation, food first all the way, but there's a role for supplementation. It could be that actually your adrenal glands might need some support, and that could be some B supplements to kind of give you a little bit of a boost. And again, with brain function here, just ever so quickly, I would focus on hydration, blood sugar, incorporating some healthy fats, particularly omega-3s in there, getting that colorful plate to maximize the fact that we are clearing all the byproducts of metabolism in your brain that maybe are clogging things up there. Getting green tea in there because L-theanine is an amino acid that helps switch on your brain and focus a little bit more. And maybe even if you're looking at supplements, dabbling with something like creatine. And then in terms of weight management, not doing anything quickly, thinking slow and steady because our bodies don't respond to deprivation very well. Understanding types of hunger. There's a physical hunger. There's also very much emotional and stress hunger. So unpacking a little bit of that if there's some emotional eating to really understand what hunger you are experiencing. Lots of women that I see actually are snacking, and they're snacking on sugary stuff. And so just really learning how to snack well. I'm a massive snacker. I love my snacks. So in the book, I've got lots of kind of different healthier snack options in there as well. And just considering things like alcohol and weight gain go well together. So alcohol and weight loss are not necessarily good friends. So perhaps considering a booze break there. And then also addressing stress is absolutely key, because if you're super, super stressed, then weight loss is not going to be a priority for your body. And just sometimes even just keeping a food diary, having that, okay, what am I actually eating? Sometimes gives a great perspective in terms of actually that's where I might be going wrong in terms of your own habits that you might have when it comes to nutrition. So just in summary then, what I want this webinar to do tonight is just help you think of your health in a wider lens than perhaps you've thought of before. The fact that, our hormones have a massive impact on pretty much everything, but that also means that we need to nourish ourselves, not just physically, but in all aspects for you to go through the menopause in a way that is going to help you be able to kind of thrive through it. And lifestyle absolutely is fundamental to this. And so I am passionate about shouting about it. And you have to be holistic in your approach of doing things. You can have the best diet in the world. You can pay a personal trainer. But if you're not spending enough time in bed and not managing your stress, then you're not going to be the best version of yourself. So just really keep that in mind. Stress management, prioritize yourself, ladies. So many people say, I don't have time. Well, you know what? If you need to make time, you need to, even if it's 1 minute, 2 minutes, to just prioritize looking after yourself. That is absolutely key, in particularly in the menopause transition. And then just remember, we're all individuals. So what this goes back to is the importance of knowing you. Know you so you know what your symptoms are. Know you so you know how the 4 fundamental nutrition principles I've talked about apply to you. And what are the things that work for you to manage your symptoms, not just to manage your symptoms, but also to help you thrive. And so I really hope that in this talk today, I've empowered you and excited you to become the expert in getting to know you. So thank you so much. There is so much more information in that book. And I'm going to put a QR code, which I hope is working here as well. And as kind of Sherry said, you can find it on Amazon and Waitrose and lots of independent bookstores and Waterstones as well. And if you want more information about me, then you can also find that on different social media platforms as well.
Thank you so much, Linia. That was amazing. Thank you. I'm just going to stop the recording and then